So I listened to a podcast by Lex Friedman probably a couple months ago about AI, and he had a guy on there that was more terrifying than anybody I've heard on AI. And he basically sold me on the idea that the moment that we hooked up AI to the internet, we created an extremely dangerous situation because we now have software that we don't fully understand or control that is connected to the internet and therefore able to replicate itself around the world to any other connected machine. So you could imagine that it could be lying to us at any point and say, no, I'm just here on this server, when it's actually at AWS and Azure, Google Cloud, and every other major data center, and it is quietly lied to us because it's smarter than we are. That idea, does anybody else find that believable? Like, to me, it sounds like something that could happen. And you also have to recognize that these computers are thinking at a speed that makes us basically like plants. Like, you think about, I have a plant in my office, and if I spin it around, it will slowly pivot toward the sun. But that's effectively, if we tried to respond to anything that the AI did, that's how slow we would be in relevance. It's just, it is making millions of moves while we're slowly pivoting toward some new direction. So, is anyone else in here, like, do we agree there's a risk of total destruction? Anyone? Am I alone? See, now that's the way I like to start the day. At least find some other. I hope I'm wrong, like, honestly, but there is this little risk. I got to walk around up here now because I've been told I have to stay behind the lectern, so this is all recorded properly. So let's get to know each other because we got just a couple minutes before we start. Yesterday I did a day-long workshop on React and lessons learned over 10 years. And the funny thing was, about a third of the room was new to React, and I went, oops, like that wasn't the idea. I was trying to do a more advanced session in there. I'm curious, who in here is working in React every day? Okay, all right, well, we're all among friends then. This is good. This is one thing that I love about Connect Tech is I can just hang out in this room today and like, all right, I can follow all these sessions. This is right up my alley. I'm also going to do something kind of strange in here, and we'll see whether you all want to play along. And I think it will be more fun if we do this. I'll be frank, I don't have any prizes to offer, but I think it'd be fun if we do this as a game. And what I'd like to do is invite people to come forward, 2 at a time, and one person can stand over here, and the other person can stand on the other side of this. And then I don't have a buzzer, but what we can do is just put your hand out, and the crowd can tell me who put their hand out first. You guys have a good view of this. So it's going to be like a game show. But what I'm going to do is you're going to be standing here, and I'm going to show you mistakes. But I'm not going to tell you what mistake I'm making. And this allows the people up front to do this. And I guess if they're struggling, then the crowd can come in and say something too. So these are all, at least, we'll see whether we have enough time to get past this. But my initial set of mistakes are all related to how we handle state and React. There's quite a list, so that'll probably fill our time, but we'll see how it goes. So that's my idea, at least. And to get us started, well, it's almost 10. Let's do this. Are there 2 people that want to come forward and do the first round? This is, oh geez. The number of people that just shook their heads like, no. Look, can I back up just a little bit? I'm going to do a little sidebar here. I want you all to know that the reason that I'm a public speaker is because I was terrified of being a public speaker. The thought of being on stage in front of you all was literally the scariest thing that I could imagine. And it was to the point that I had social anxiety, like I wanted to stay in my house. I didn't want to leave the house. The thought of a networking event or anything like that just sounded awful to me. And I reached a fork in the road where I said I could either let this proliferate and slowly create this sort of doom loop, or I could just run at it instead and say, what is the thing that I could do that would be most unlike this situation? Well, I could submit to a conference. And I got accepted to a local conference in my hometown, and I spoke, and I didn't die. That was it. And so you fast forward, this was 10 years ago, and I have now spoken over 250 times at sessions all over the place. Now my job is basically to teach people, train people, and this is easy. So I say that to say, you coming up here and trying to guess on the thing, if you don't guess it, that's fine. Like being in front of a crowd, it's good for everybody to get comfortable with it. And you may not guess, but that's okay too. So that's my little sidebar. All right, let's talk React now. It's 10:01, it's game on. Who's the first two? Wonderful, right on the front row. Okay, you can come up here. What's your name? Todd is coming up here. Give Todd a hand, come on. And who's else coming up here for the other side? Anybody? There we go. Come on down. And what is your name? Natalie. Okay, Natalie. So we are going to fire up. Natalie, come on up here. And what I'm going to do is just fire up a new file right here. And the reason I'm firing up a new file is I want to do some work in React. And let's do something pretty simple to start. So I'm just going to say export function contact form. And my font is going to need to be quite a bit bigger here, but the good news is I can zoom like crazy because we're not going to have a whole lot of code at any given time. How's the back row feeling? Do y'all need more zoom? You're good. Okay. So we're going to begin. I'm creating a contact form, y'all. So this contact form. Yes, yeah, and you can jump in at any given point, which can start a conversation too. So I'm not going to tell you when I've fully done the mistake, but I'm going to say this contact form is going to have some const, and I'm going to, oh, by the way, I have GitHub Copilot on, so you may see suggestions that I ignore, but I highly recommend Copilot. So let's start. It's going to have a subject and a set subject, and we're going to set that state to empty. We're going to have a const a message and a set message. We might also have any other state in here. Obviously, I need to import this state. So we've got a few pieces in here. Now, this is likely to get more complicated over the time. Maybe I'm going to have a subject and it's going to have different types of subjects. Maybe also in here we have other things like const, maybe my role, and I set the role and this sort of thing. Is anybody seeing any concerns as I continue to make this more complicated here? And if not, that's okay too. This can be subtle. If I may go to the crowd here because the crowd is chomping at the bit here. What is the crowd saying?
Well, you're using a lot of use states. It's starting to create bad conditions.
Bad condition. What do you mean by bad conditions?
Well, if you have to update, say, 3 of those at the same time, you can run into problems with React not liking to do that.
There we go. So, well, when we talk about 3 at the same time, here's what I'm getting at. Let me maybe show another example here. Imagine that I have this component, and what I'm actually doing is I've got a form for users here. And I have a first name and a set first name and so on. And actually here, if I take this out, then Copilot will help me out here. Set first name, and then Copilot's going to start guessing. So this is actually one of the things I really like about Copilot is, watch this. So I come into here, and then it starts guessing. Oh, no, that wasn't the next one I wanted. I might say address and city and state. So does this emphasize the issue a little bit more? Yeah. What would we do instead to fix this? Either you can jump in. Just put your arm out. I think you were first. Okay, so go ahead.
I create one use state that's an object that maintains all those values probably.
Give her a hand. There we go. All right, so that was it. So create one object, and that is super simple. And I do this drama here just to draw to the fact, all right, I think you guys are good. Thank you for coming up. Give them a hand here. So the reason that I say this is, when we have a bunch of separate states, there's a few problems that happen here. And you got it, part of it here is, can anybody think about this? Let me show this. What's going to happen here in a moment? I'm going to be in this users component, and at some point, presumably, maybe this is a component where I'm saving a user. So at that point then, I'm going to want to handle a submit. And this is another great way that Copilot helps me out here. I'm going to hit tab. So it just guessed that my handle submit would look something like this. So now, what is the pain that we're feeling here? I mean, Copilot kind of paved over it for me because it jumped in here. But look at, what is it that's unfortunate here?
that each individual one house
Yeah.
destructures the data.
So we could presume, for instance, imagine that I am saving this user's data. Presumably, let's say I'm hitting a REST API. That REST API is going to require me probably to send a user object, and that user object is going to have all these properties on it. So if I have to do, that's why this data object is useful here, because imagine that I say right here, save user to API. And I call, via fetch. So I'm putting a little comment in here just to kind of get some help from Copilot here. And then I can say fetch, and it's just going to pop in a random URL. That's fine. And then in here, I could put in other details about the method post, the body, and this whole thing. So when I send it up, I would stringify this data up here above, send it to the right URL and things. But this act of having to glue things together is extra work. The other cost of this is, think about, I didn't just have to glue it together. When I fetch it, what I'm probably going to get is a user object if I got the existing record. So if I have separate state here, I find myself, oh, I want to initialize this initial state right here. Well, I would have to strip that object apart to put it in here twice. So has anybody else seen this problem? It's pretty dang common. Figured I'd see quite a few hands here. So what I look for is this.
Is there concern for performance also in the usage of all of these several states?
So people bring this up quite often, the concern about performance. And this is where, if we're going to talk about state, we should talk about performance anyway. A baseline in React. So I've been working in React for 10 years. But here's, or darn near 10 years, because it's only been around for 10 years. But I started just basically after it was open sourced. A baseline that I found in React is try to do the thing that is most ergonomic. In other words, be selfish, do the thing that's easy. And most of the time, in my experience, if we do that, performance isn't an issue. Now, there is a big caveat here, which is if you think that the easiest thing is putting all the state in the top component, then you're going to have performance problems. But that's not actually the easiest thing. Because if you put all the state in the top component, what happens? Yeah, what is the term for when I've got to pass things down a bunch of levels? Prop drilling. And I'm not necessarily a big fan of that term because honestly, I feel like prop drilling has given some React developers this sense of, oh, okay, then I need to avoid passing props because passing props down a level is prop drilling. No. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. At what point would you use the term prop drilling? If I have, for instance, this component right here, I've got my users component, and then underneath I have a, let's see, we'll put it right down here. What if underneath I'm calling a component that's called user details, and I pass it a user object right here? Did I just prop drill?
No, you're just passing props.
I'm just passing props. Now, what if the user details passes it down to a child component? Now am I prop drilling?
Maybe. Depends on whether or not user details is using those props or if it's just passing them through.
Okay, so now you make a good distinction, that question of, is this component merely passing it along? And that is a great line too, but I want to frame this in a way that you might not have thought of before. Remember, a React component is just a function. A prop is just an argument. And how often do we use the term argument drilling in software? Have you heard people ever say that? Because I haven't. I have heard people sometimes say, it's getting painful passing this arg around, and that may be a sign that maybe we've got the state in the wrong spot, maybe we need to refactor, and then even in some cases we will say, maybe this should be global state because we're passing it literally everywhere.
You say coupling is too high.
Because coupling is too high, okay. Oh, I just remembered, y'all. I'm supposed to stay back here so I'm on the screen. Hi, camera. They've been hearing my voice for okay, well, talk back in here. So I like to be out in the middle though. Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question? Because I got told your statement.
There's too much coupling between the components.
Yeah. So let's do this for a second. I want to just survey the room. So Put your hand up at the point that you feel like it is prop drilling. If I'm passing props down one level, is that prop drilling? 2 levels. Okay, at 2 levels, we've got like 3.5 hands, but they're kind of shaky. Okay, 3 levels. Okay, at 3 levels, half the room jumps in. 3 levels. That seems early to me. And I would challenge you this. How often do you pay attention to how many times you're passing arguments around in plain old functions? And are you counting in your head and saying, that's the 3rd time I passed it. Uh-oh. Now I'm argument drilling. So I just encourage you to think about maybe we're going overboard on worrying about prop drilling. Passing arguments scales just fine. And the reason that we might worry about prop drilling might be because, sorry, what's your name? Andy. Okay, so Andy had mentioned, he made a good distinction. The question was, does user details actually use the user object or not? And yeah, that's an interesting distinction, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with having a function that merely delegates some data down to another. Now, if we find many layers of functions doing that, then that might be the sign. So that's my little sidebar there. Hopefully that helps a little bit to bring a little nuance. And I would also point out, there are 2 mistakes that you can make when it comes to this whole situation about state and prop drilling. You may be too worried about it, at which point, what happens when you think that prop drilling is passing props down 1 level or 2 levels? What mistake would I end up making at that point? What would my code look like at that point? Yeah, you end up with everything global. Because what else can you do? You think in your head, oh, I can't pass props. I've got to go make this global. I have worked in code bases that are that way. You don't want that. And I think all of us intuitively know, for the most part, that's a painful place to be. What if we go the other way and we assume that prop drilling doesn't matter at all? What is the pain point that we ultimately feel?
Lots and lots of state updates.
Lots and lots of state updates, although that can potentially happen if you use context, for instance, and put it at the wrong space. You're still going to get a lot of renders if you don't do that right, for instance, although there are good alternatives to context as well. That is true. And then also you end up at some point with a lot of components that have props that they don't use, which adds a little bit of noise to the situation. And it also adds a little bit of, what is the term? Well, it's a little bit of overhead. So both of those do have a cost. I just want to point out that there's some useful middle ground there to consider. Okay, so next one. Do we have 2 volunteers? Da-dun-dun, da-dun-dun. I saw you 2. Yep, a back row in the blue and then in the black shirt with the glasses, I think. Those were the 2 hands I saw first. Come on down. And what are your names? Yeah, you got to come up here. That's the whole point, to get in front of the crowd. Y'all can address the crowd and pontificate with your answer too. Like, this is your chance. And what's your name? Ben? All right, Ben's coming down, and I think I saw your hand. There we go. That looked like a volunteer. And what's your name? Cody. Okay. So Ben, you can come stand right here. And Cody's coming up to join you. So what we're going to look at here is, let's imagine I've got all this going on here, and what I'm going to do is come in here. I've got this form. Assume I've got a form down here below, and I want to populate that form with some data from the database, because we got this form down here that contains a bunch of user data in it. So what I'm going to do is create my good friend useEffect here, and inside my useEffect, I'm going to come in here, and what I want to do is fetch user and populate the state right here, inside here. So I'm going to fetch, I'm going to take this response, and then I'm going to set all of my state data up here. So this is the code right here, lines 9 through 19. And this is code that you've probably all seen many times before. I'm going to use useEffect to go get some data and populate a form with data from that database. Do any of you have any concerns with what I've done here? There's a few different angles you could go, and I'll let you guys decide first. I'm done with the demo, so any concerns you guys see? Yep.
No dependency array.
That was one. So this is one of the most annoying things about React is that default of if I forget, hey, would you like an infinite loop? Thanks. What a great default. It's use effect is really frustrating. So I need to come down here and do this so that it happens just once. I'm sure everybody in here has shot themselves in the foot with that one a few times, warmed up their laptop. Yeah, oh, let's not do this. Okay, so that was a good one, and I did not mean to pop this up, sorry. Okay, do you guys see other issues? Because there are some others.
There's no dependencies there, so it's going to run that use effect like 5-6 times.
Oh, it will run it only one time, because on line 21, it'll run what, 5 times?
It'll dispatch setting values multiple times.
So that used to be the case. Does anybody know, though? Yeah.
React 18 auto batches those.
Yes, okay, so that was true until React 18. They started batching. So it's actually okay for me to do 14 through 18 here. It's going to do all that together in one update. So React made that nice for us. But that was true until, yeah, very recently. So that was a nice change. Anything else you guys see? If not, we'll see what the crowd says here.
Server state management is way more complex than that. You should probably use a data fetching tool to handle that instead.
That's like a big overarching thing that, yeah, I think I can agree with. So
Yeah, I haven't done it like this for a long time.
haven't done it. Okay, so when you say you haven't done it like this, what have you done instead?
I think React Router has some things, and I think we use React Query.
There we go. Okay, and that is a wonderful answer. So I'm going to give you a double win here. So it's Ben, right?
That was a competition.
Yeah. I didn't know. Well, we're trying to make it like a game show. Okay, give these guys a hand. We'll say 2 here. So, okay. And what, it was Ben, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what Ben said was we use React Query instead. And that's part of what I'm getting at is I'll make a bold statement in here. Use effect is a code smell. A pretty strong code smell. And I say that because let me make sure that everybody understands. Oh yeah, camera's over here. Everybody understand. I want to make sure you all understand what a code smell is, at least in my definition. A code smell does not mean I made a mistake. It means it's a common sign that I might have made a mistake. Use effect is not worthless. It's not something we should never use, but I would estimate that 90-something% of the use effects that I see should and could be avoided. And avoiding them tends to result in simpler code. Now, if you ever followed David Korshid, who's the creator of XState, he goes by David K. Piano on Twitter. That's why I had to hesitate for a second. So David's done a wonderful job talking about all the reasons that use effect is probably something you want to avoid. And I've tweeted about it a fair amount too. Now, the thing is, the reason that this becomes such an issue is multifaceted, and it's Sean, right? Okay, so Sean pointed out fetching is complicated. It's quite complicated, and it's really easy to go into use effect and slap a fetch in here and get the data and store it in state. But we start forgetting about some of the edge cases. So I could have kept you guys up here for a while and seen if you could find other problems with my code here. Let's talk about a few things. What have I not handled right now? There's no error handling. So one thing in here is I need to put a .catch and then take this error, and with this error, maybe I will set error to error because I need, I don't actually have this state set yet, but bear with me in here. So now I've got a catch in here. What else have I forgotten to do? Loading state. Okay, so the second one is loading state. Well, how would I handle loading state? Well, then I need another loading state handler in here, which means I might need to come in here and say set loading to true. And then down here in my response.json, when I finally get all this, I'm actually also going to need to say set loading to false. I've got to go declare that state up above. So now I've got 3 different pieces of state, my data, my loading, my error, all part of this. Oh, this is very important. One sidebar. I saw your hand, but give me 1 second. This couldn't be more important. I got to get a picture of y'all because you look fantastic. We got a big room in here. So I like to put hands up like we're at the amusement park. It just makes the pic more fun. Hands up, 1, 2, 3. Oh, y'all look good. All right, watch Twitter. I'll tweet it out and see if you can find your face. Prove to your boss that you showed up. You weren't outside drinking. So, yeah, okay. All right, so someone raised their hand. Yeah, go ahead.
You're also assuming data is populated in that from the API.
Okay, that's another, so that's another big thing here. And as a side note, when it comes to state, I don't know if I actually have a slide on this, so I'm just going to sidebar on it at the moment. I don't know, for instance, whether the JSON that I get back from this call is going to be the JSON that I expect. And you might think, well, hey, Cory, you're working in TypeScript, so it's typed. What's wrong with that argument? You still have to validate. Well, why can't TypeScript protect me?
Because it only works at runtime. It only works at compilation time.
Exactly. TypeScript is a compilation tool. It is not a runtime tool. So what is everybody doing right now to make sure that they're getting the JSON they expect? Anybody have a favorite tool? Zod. All hail Zod. Yeah, so I heard 2 Zod. Anybody using something other than Zod?
Zod built into my API client so I can pass in validation schemas on each request. So instead of doing like a .then and doing it, you bake it into your actual API client code.
I want to talk to you after. That sounds cool. I haven't actually. Has anybody seen what he just described? The idea of having, basically you've got Zod support inside of your API. Are you going to demo that in your talk today? Let's do that. Okay. Guys, after my talk, Sean and I are going to be outside the hall here. There'll be a good demo. That sounds fantastic. I really like that idea. Okay, so I brought up Zod because what I could do with Zod, and this will show you, I'll come up here. And let's just create a little schema, and I'll say const user schema is equal to z.object, and then in here, do something like this. And so what I've just created here is a Zod schema. Now it says it can't find Z because I haven't installed Z. Again, I'm being very freewheeling here. This is important because this has a runtime manifestation. So I could take this user schema and right in here, I could do my fetch. And in here, after I parse it, I could take this data and I could say const result is equal to user schema.parse data. And what would happen here on line 23 if I get unexpected JSON? It'll throw an error. And you might think, well, how's that useful? If I got the wrong JSON, my app's going to crash anyway. So why is this better? Either way, my app's going to crash. But why is it better for it to crash on line 23 instead of line 95? Exactly. Have you ever heard the term fail fast, fail early, fail explicitly? Tell me that moment. Like I would love to see, as a developer, I love when I run these things, because here's what tends to happen. I'm coding along one day, and then at 2 in the afternoon, inexplicably, the app crashes, and I'm going, I just loaded this 5 minutes ago, and I haven't changed any code. And then I look down here, and I go, what the heck? I'm suddenly getting different JSON from the API? Oh, somebody just made a push to dev, broke the API, and I'm not getting the same JSON anymore. Now I can go reach out to that person, and they're going to have it fresh in their mind. They're going to go, oh yeah, I'm sorry. I know how to fix this. That was my mistake. Now given, automated tests are a conversation, CI and all these other things are a conversation, but nonetheless, when errors happen, Zod gives them quickly. So this idea of state that is validated at runtime is powerful. But here's what I want to challenge you on. I just showed you one good use for Zod, which is validate your JSON that you get from any of your API calls. What are other places that we're getting data from outside of our application where TypeScript can't protect us because it's runtime data? It's unmanaged. Can you think of some other places that it's important for us to validate that input? I heard, did you say user data? When you say user data, oh, that's what you mean by user data. Yeah, so form data is a great example. So if I'm going to create a form, then maybe it would be useful for me to create a Zod schema that describes that form's requirements. And so for instance, Zod, although I haven't shown it here, Zod is actually more powerful than TypeScript. Zod is more descriptive than TypeScript. I can say that it has a min length and a max length. I can say that it's optional or required. I can say that it's an email or a URL, and so on. Yes?
That's a package. How do you spell it? I've never.
Oh, I'm actually glad you brought that up because I should show everybody. So go to zod.dev, and you will find Zod. Now, Zod is just one tool among quite a few others. You've probably heard of Yup or Joy or, well, wait, is Joy one of them? Yup is one. There's anybody think of others that compete with Zod? There's one that just came out that a few people seem pretty excited about. I haven't used it yet. Okay, at the moment, Zod seems to be the most popular way to do what I'm describing here, but just recognize other tools out there do similar things. The thing that makes Zod really compelling is that I can use z.infer so that I can generate a TypeScript type from the Zod schema. So I could create a Zod schema and then derive a TypeScript type from it, which is pretty cool. And I can actually show that here too. Well, if I actually installed Zod. Actually, I do have Zod installed. I just need to import it here. I think I have Zod installed in this project. No. There we go. And it thinks it can't find it, but trust me, it is here. So I could use type right here, user, and I can say that it is z.infer type of user schema. When I hover over user, I get a type of user, and that user has a type that contains all these properties. So you end up declaring your types using Zod and then inferring your TypeScript types from that, because this is a rule. You can't do the inverse very well because, again, Zod is more descriptive than TypeScript. So you can get TypeScript types from Zod, but you can't really get good Zod schemas from TypeScript because TypeScript doesn't let me do things like say that I want a string between these two values. That's an example, or that it's a URL and so on. Okay, so that's a little sidebar there. Now, any other thoughts or questions on this before we move on to the next adventure here? We already covered another one, that multiple use state calls in a row. Oh yes, back here.
You use GraphQL schema with GoGen. Is it trustworthy enough to not check the data runtime?
Your question was, what about a GraphQL schema? I'm unclear.
You say GraphQL with GoGen. Is that reliable as not replacement? Answer yes.
Yeah. Yes, although I was thinking about, it is a Zod replacement for that piece of it, but I guess that's where, I've gotten sidetracked. The reason that I was pausing on that is I asked a question earlier that we actually didn't answer fully. Where else is this idea of validating user data at runtime useful? Somebody had mentioned a form where I'm entering data, validating that form. Can we think of other examples? Exactly, the URL. So I use Zod to parse the URL because maybe we've got an ID in the URL or a search term or a few different tags and it's a finite list of those. I want to use Zod to say parse that URL, and if it is not in a valid form, throw an error. And the beauty of this is this also type narrows, because what will happen is if I read the URL, it's going to be a string. But it might be a situation where that URL is supposed to be one of just a few values. So I can tell Zod that it's got to be one of those few values, and if it isn't, then fail at that point. So now I've got a narrow type for the URL, which is nice, and I parse it, and if that URL is wrong, I can immediately tell users about it. So URL is a great example of where I might use Zod. Okay, that is another. So the other thing that I wanted to show in here is I'm going to come over here to Twitter. So, yes?
You just threw out there that you use effect of code smell, but what do you use instead?
Yeah, so I had said that use effects of code smell, and then I got sidetracked. Thank you. That'll get us back on the rails. So that was what I was going to show right now. What I would use instead is exactly what Ben mentioned, although that's one of many options. So let me actually just do it this way. I'm going to fire up TextPad here, because what I want to see here is how many things we can mention that we could do instead of fetching within use effect. Because there's quite a few. So the first one, which already came up, is React Query. And if you have not heard of React Query, what React Query is a library that will fetch data for you in the end. Now, what makes React Query special is it contains a whole bunch of other useful features. Some of those features you probably have never even thought to build before. And if you go to this comparison page right here, it shows all the different things that are built in here. One of the things that you've probably forgotten to do on many projects is caching. Caching is easy to overlook. With React Query, we declare a key and it caches that call. So for instance, maybe I've got a call to get users and that call takes 2 seconds. Well, once I've fetched that data, if a user goes to another page and I try to fetch users, it's going to immediately display from cache. And then it does something very cool, which is it checks the server behind the scenes to see whether there's new data. And then if there is new data, it shows it once it's available. So you get the best of both worlds. You get this instant experience from cached data, but you also aren't looking at stale data for very long, because as long as the call is fast, you're going to see the fresh data pop in. So that's one of the benefits. Other things that you get, though, is some of these things in here. Polling, parallel queries, dependent queries, infinite queries, and some of these cool things too. If my network fails, imagine I drive through a tunnel. When I come out of that tunnel, React Query senses that I now have a network connection again, and it fetches data. If I also leave my tab open on Friday and I go home for the weekend, I come back on Monday, the moment that I focus that tab, React Query fetches new data behind the scenes to see if there's anything new. So I'm now looking at the latest data. Those are the sorts of things that, honestly, I have not done in my career consistently. I have only done it if somebody happened to require it, and it was very rare that any product owner happens to even think about this stuff. But the fact that it is just built in is fantastic. Now, this table's huge, and I'm not going to belabor it, but the chances are a lot of the things that this is doing are things that ideally your app would do to improve the user experience and make it more robust, but it either hasn't come to mind or it's just too much work to do. So having it built in is the win. So that's my real answer to the question of why is useEffect a smell? Well, at least for fetching, it's a smell because there are better abstractions available today. This uses useEffect behind the scenes, but we don't have to use it. Let this abstract it for us. Yeah, hand in the back.
I was just going to say, along with caching, something that's really powerful is cache invalidation. So if something happens over here, other things need to change, you can just invalidate those things.
Yes, exactly. So when data changes, I invalidate that cache, and then React Query knows that it needs to go fetch new data. I can also decide how long that cache is valid, configure the usual sorts of things. Now, the way that I do all of this is by setting a key. That key is a unique key for that data. And I don't want to make this sound overly easy, because frankly, that's the hard part, is deciding, okay, how do we structure our keys in a way that's manageable? So we got to decide as a team and be consistent and so on there. So I brought this up, though. React Query, if I used React Query, I want to give you a sense of the before and after. So I'm coming over here to my profile on Twitter. I have a pinned tweet that sort of hits some of the highlights that I'm trying to hit in this talk. So if you go look at my account, I'm at Twitter/HouseCore. And yes, the URL is still Twitter, but you can call it X. Twitter still works, so I'm going to call it Twitter. So I'm going to scroll down here. This is the point. So I love this visualization. Let me pause for a second. So this is the before. This is basically the code that I wrote earlier here, but in this example, I'm getting products. And notice the work that I had to do. I had to have 3 different pieces of state for each fetch call. I need to have state to hold the data. I need to have state for loading and state for error. So that's a lot of work to set this up. I have to fetch it, and then I've got to make sure that I'm setting all that state appropriately. I've got to make sure that I'm setting loading false down here once it's done. And I needed to make sure that I put it in the finally too, because why do I need to call loading false in finally?
Because the errors won't happen if you don't put it in there.
Exactly. It's really easy to, I think I just lost my mic. Did I? Yeah. I'm guessing that my battery is not so happy. Well, no, it's bright green. I don't know. Maybe something went up there. Yeah. I don't know if somebody wants to peek their head out and see if, hopefully I'm coming across okay in the back, but yeah, that may be a problem for the recording at least. So, okay. Now notice all of this, and imagine this. What you're seeing on the screen is one HTTP request. Have you ever worked on a component that makes more than one HTTP request? Everybody nods their head. Let me give you an example of how out of hand this can be. I have a client who has a page that makes 55 HTTP requests. Now that's too many. To be clear, the reason they're making that many requests is because they created a RESTful endpoint for every table in the database, and then they are joining all that data on the client. Don't do that. So I say that though because look at this. This fills the whole screen. If I was making a reasonable number, say 3 or 4 HTTP calls, now I've got, 12 pieces of state up here, and they all have to be named. They can't be called loading and error. It has to be called is user loading, is products loading, is error for this particular endpoint. Hello, I swear I didn't do anything. It says I've got a battery. So I think it's probably something over there, but I don't know. I could turn this off and back on if you think it helps.
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think this one's working fine. It's just this one's not, the room mic.
Yeah.
So
I have.
do you project? Okay. Very good. Project I will. All right, so I'm going to hit play, and we see the after happen here. So we collapse this and recognize the end point here that we're seeing is calling useFetch. Now, useFetch is my own invention. This is actually a clip from my course, Managing React State. It's on Pluralsight. It's a 5-hour course on React State. I didn't expect it to be that long, but frankly, there's a lot of conversation to have on doing state well. Like you think about how often you turn something off and back on because it doesn't work. The reason that happened is because state is hard. So there's a lot of ways to mess that up. So what I do in the course is I create basically an abstraction that is similar to React Query. And I create it from scratch so that you can see how it's made and you realize, well, it's not really magic. It's a custom hook that contains a use effect in it, that contains some state inside, that contains logic for retrying and caching and so on. So it's not magic, but I don't recommend using your own custom hook. I recommend using some libraries instead. Okay, so that is my very long answer to the question that thank you for bringing me back there. So use effect is effectively outdated for at least data fetching. There are other ways that we could use effect, and I'll see if I can get to some of the other ways we can replace it here in a moment because they're separate questions. But before we do, I want to draw attention to the fact that there are a huge number of ways to make fetches that do not involve you using useEffect today. And there's a talk by Sean, I think right after me, where he's going to get into this more. So I'm teeing this up for you, Sean. I'm excited for your talk. Okay, another example. SWR is an alternative to React Query. They're very similar. It's by Vercel, quite popular. No, SWR, I do mean it. Okay, another one. I could fetch via Apollo. A lot of people probably heard of Apollo. Back of the room, very excited, okay. I could also fetch using Relay. I could fetch using a React router loader. If you haven't tried loaders in React Router, those are pretty cool. What am I forgetting? Oh, here's another one. I could fetch via RSC. What do I mean by RSC? A React Server Component. Has anybody used RSC yet? Oh, I'm excited. I think it's awesome. I demoed it yesterday. Next.js makes this really easy. But with React Server Components, you make a fetch in your function. Like this, if you haven't seen React Server Components, let me just give you a sense of how bananas this is, that I can come in here and I could say export function users, and maybe I want to display a list of users right here, and I could say const resp equals await fetch get my users. Now I need to mark this as async right here. And I've got this long URL. I'm going to shorten the URL just for our purposes. So I could take this fetch then, and I could, I heard something for a second. I think we're on the right track. And I could read those users, and then I can return, well, whatever. For now, I'm just going to return users.length right here. If you have not seen React Server Components, this is valid code. This is amazing. Like, think about what I'm not having to do. I didn't have to define use effect. I didn't have to create all this state. I am able to do an async call right here at the top of my component. And you might wonder, how the heck does this work? Because what about re-renders and all this? Well, this is rendered on the server, so it only renders once. So I don't have to worry about this firing multiple times. And I've marked it async, so I can do awaits along the way. Whatever I return down here is what's going to render. This is reality today if you use Next.js, and soon in other frameworks. Remix is working on this sort of thing. Remix has their own sort of similar flavors with loaders and things. And by the way, that would be another option right here, Remix loader. So anybody have others that I should list here?
Redux to Kit query.
RTK query, yes, I totally forgot that. Yeah, that's pretty popular. Ways to fetch without use effect. I got to tweet this out. This feels like a banger. Yep. Okay. So, wow. You found it. Okay. So, oh, all right. Okay. So, this is why we probably don't need use effect. All right. So we are, let's see, are we done here at 10:50? Is that right? Thumbs up. Okay. So we got like 9 minutes here, but that gives us enough time to talk about another one here. I'm checking my notes and deciding which one that I want to use. Yeah, we've sort of talked about this already. Okay, I actually want to pivot over here. Instead of doing the game show thing, I want to come over here to this tweet again. Because again, this is a lot about state anyway. If I were to boil down one of the core mistakes that happens in React is not understanding the 8 ways to handle React state. And so this is a slide from the course itself. But let's talk through these and talk through how these get missed. Now, I just tweeted out this morning this issue of, I see this a lot on Teams where somebody will open a pull request and they will say, steps to test this thing, and they will say, click on this button, expand this tab, open this accordion, scroll down under this header, and then you should see this thing. And that happens all the time on projects I'm working on. What is the smell there? What's wrong with that?
Not using the URL effectively.
Yeah, we're not using the URL effectively. Like everything that I just described could be conveyed in the URL. If a certain tab is selected, ideally the URL reflects that. Why is it important that the URL reflects what tab I'm on?
Reload.
If I hit reload, it'd be nice if I saw the same thing again. Absolutely, that's one. If I share it with somebody else, it'd be nice if they saw the same thing. Otherwise they go, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not seeing what you see. And then well, let's get on a call, share your screen. And I go, oh yeah, sorry. I guess you've got to click here and here because the URL doesn't actually reflect a unique resource locator. It's a partial, effectively. Yes. And then the third thing, which I already mentioned, which is ideally the URL makes it so we can just put a URL into a ticket and we can get to it. Another example is if I bookmark it, I'd like to be able to come back later and see what I was looking at. Ooh, there we go. All right. So we're good. Thank you. Magic. Okay. Web storage is another example. Now, web storage is not tied to React in any way. It is indicative of any, or I should say it's available for any web application, but it's easy to overlook. Some places that I might use web storage is maybe I've got some settings or some temporary data that is non-sensitive and I just want to store it there. And I do emphasize non-sensitive. You have to think very carefully about what you're going to put into there, but sometimes that can be useful. Sometimes I might want to use web storage because I want effectively a local database. Like one of my clients right now is dealing with the problem of we've got people out in the field, they're on iPads, and they often have flaky internet connections because they're literally out in farm fields, that sort of thing. And you might not have a good signal, but they want to be able to enter a bunch of information, store it, and even maybe see their battery crash and not lose it. So what do you do in that case? Well, you got to store it somewhere locally, and you can use IndexedDB for that. So that could be a great way to go. And then once the internet comes back, you push stuff up. That's an example. Local state. Now, local state is useful when one component needs the state. Sometimes you're going to find that two components need that same state. What if these two components need the same state? How do I solve that problem? Someone just said context. That is true, but often that's cutting paper with an axe. What is wrong with immediately jumping to context once two components need state?
Pushing it way up the chain into the global space.
Yeah, you said you're pushing it up the chain, way up the chain to the global space. Well, not necessarily, because context, I can put it on a subtree, but I am adding a lot of complexity because now I've got to configure the context. I've got to go set it up at the parent. I also now have the mental complexity of global state too. So there's various issues there. There's the solution when I have two components that need to share that same state is to lift that state to the parent. That's why I showed that little icon right there is find the common parent and pass it down. And hopefully that common parent is only a level or two above. But if you find that it's 42 levels above, okay, now it's time to talk context. Now you really do have a giant app and you've got data that's truly global. Derived state. I wish I had time to get more into derived state, but derived state is the secret to writing simpler applications. Again, this is not unique to React. This can happen in any framework, but only declare state when you have to. And to give you an example of this whole thing, down here on forms, the way that I handle forms is deriving state. So for instance, I don't need to have errors in state. I can derive errors from the fact that is this field empty? If it's required, then I know there's an error. I don't have to have separate state for that. I already have the information I need and I can calculate it on each render. Imagine, for instance, that I want to display a header that says 42 records found. Well, I don't need separate state that stores the number of records found. I can just do a dot length on the array. That's a simple example, but people sometimes miss the other opportunities to just derive state on each render. So that's a big opportunity there. Okay, so I also show this just to point out one other thing. Notice sometimes we end up with multiple pieces of state that actually should be glued together because they represent one core idea. And an example of that is form status. So I've got this slide here that mentions it. So I've got these three pieces of state above. Is the form submitting? Is it submitted? Is it completed? Well, what the heck does it mean if all three of those are true? That's a bug. So what if instead I just have one piece of state called status, and then at any given time it's in one particular state? So you could call this a state enumeration, but the point is often it's useful to have a single status variable. So if you see related items, then you can effectively make the impossible impossible, because it should be impossible for the form to be both submitting and completed at the same time. So I need to collapse those states down into one status variable. So that's an example there. Okay, so we've had some fun. People came forward, hopefully learned a few things. There are a lot more lessons in here because, again, I'm trying to take highlights from a 5-hour course, but if you are interested in learning more, I have this tweet pinned, which will be pretty useful for a lot of these things. I also have a number of courses out on Pluralsight, on React, on JavaScript, on careers, on .NET, but primarily front-end oriented stuff. So if you come out here, you see my face, there's 14 courses out here. The Managing React State course, I'm actually publishing an update to it within the next week. So that said, what's there is totally valid. I basically put the new slides in. They have some fancy new colors and things. But honestly, no story about React State has actually changed much in the last 3 years. For the most part, we're still doing the same sorts of things with state. We have some new ways to fetch, for instance. RSC is interesting, but fairly timeless principles there. Also, I feed my children by being a consultant. So you can find me at reactjsconsulting.com. I help teams working in React be more effective, move faster, transition to React. I do code reviews, I do training, and I often contribute as well in various ways as an architect or on the team part-time. So you can reach out to me here, and I think that's it. I also have a talk this afternoon that just got scheduled a few hours ago. You may not see it on the schedule. You have to like shift refresh to see it. It's the last slot of the day because someone else didn't show up, so now you're stuck with me at the end of the day. But I'm doing a talk about reusable components that are actually reusable. So that'll be the talk at the end of the day. Was this helpful? Y'all learned a few things, hopefully? Wonderful. Thank you for coming.